Well, join me tonight in Ecclesiastes 12 as we are coming down to just the next to last message from the book. And so we've been seeing this whole series about items that we are prone to think will make us happy, and yet they cannot. They don't have the capacity to do that. They don't have the ability to do that. And so the author has been trying to help us see that as somebody who has not only pursued some of those, but as somebody who's watched others pursue them. And ultimately what he's been guiding us to, his favorite theme, his favorite thought, has been the God in heaven and our lives here under the sun, and how we need to move from what we would gravitate towards and rather align with him as in heaven, in his economy, his priorities, rather than on earth under the sun as we would look at him and think. And so he's been trying to help us gauge and evaluate priorities, values, relationships, pursuits through the life that's viewed under God's rule in heaven. So we come to chapter 12 tonight, and last week the author spoke about 3 imperatives for the younger generation to consider out of chapter 11, 9, and 10, that they needed to rejoice. And he says that there in verse 9, "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth. Walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou, for all these things God will bring thee into judgment." So he said, you need to rejoice. It's good to rejoice. It's good to rejoice even when you're a young person. But he did caution them, no, whatever choices you make need to be in light of our God in heaven. Know that judgment will be upon any of our decisions, for good or bad. And he says, "Therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity." He said, because you're going to be living this life as a young person with a whole life ahead of you in adulthood, you begin now to remove from your life those things and the decisions by God's help to be in alignment with him, rather than choose the pursuits that would appeal to the frivolity of youth. And so he moves on with a continuation of that thought in chapter 12 where we're at, where he says this, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. When should I remember my Creator? While the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. When should I remember him? In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders shall cease because they are few, and those that look out the windows be darkened." We should remember him before those things take place. Before the doors, in verse 4, are shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Also, when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Wherever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitchers be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. Here the author is, again, speaking in a continuation of his theme about what should be considered as young people in regards to God and the rest of their life. And the thought he's given us tonight is this, that we want to remember God in life because you're going to see him again after your death. And we kind of laugh about this. We kind of have a running joke in our family when it comes to the issue of death. Anytime one of us has only gotten worse as we all get older and go to the doctor more, it's kind of this running joke in our family. When I called Dad maybe had an appointment, checking up on his cancer treatment or whatnot. What did the doctor say? The same answer. I could tell you 100 times it's going to be the same answer. You know what the same answer is? He said, "I'm terminal, son." He said, "I'm terminal." Every time. You call Mom, "I'm terminal." She called me and asked me about something when I went to the doctor last year. "I'm terminal." It's an ongoing joke because we're all tongue-in-cheek about this. You're born basically to die. That's the ironic reality of human life, isn't it? I know, it's a cheery thought for a rainy Wednesday night. I know, but we're born to die. We're born, there's the excitement of life, there's the excitement of birth and this new life going forward, but at the same time, too, there's always the looming reality that death will take place. I'd say perhaps nothing is as certain and equally uncertain in this life as death. And perhaps then nothing is quite as deceptive as our subjection to it until our frailty makes it known to us in undeniable ways. What do you mean, Pastor? Meaning this: we're prone to errantly think we'll enjoy health as we always have enjoyed health until some medical or tragic circumstance changes that, right? How many of you in here would say, man, in my mind, I'm still 22 or whatever it is? Yeah. But then your body does what? It reminds you of the opposite. And I think depending on who you are and what you've done in your life, maybe years just make that more and more evident, right? And so here it is. Solomon knows that reality we all hold in our hearts. That reality is this, that we know death is certain and yet uncertain at the same time. We know it's inevitable and it will come to pass, and yet our sinful nature always bucks against it, fights against it, even denies it, and we think we will continue on as we always have until there is some circumstance or some issue or event that reveals to us otherwise. And so it's to this end that Solomon continues his conversation from verses 9 and 10, as we call them. Having given the three imperatives for young people to heed, he wants them to ponder their temporal existence in the light of the eternal God who created them. So Solomon gives a vivid picture of death to reveal our frailty and remind us of the God that we will return to. It may not be the cheeriest of subject matters to talk about the reality of looming unexpected death, but it is a very important and sober reminder, because not just that we're going to die, but that there's a God who created us who we are ultimately accountable to. And that's the important theme he wants to address. Since we die, let us focus upon the God of this life and the eternity thereafter. So when it comes to this issue of remembering God in life, because we're going to see Him at our death, number one, I want us to think about this. God should be heeded before He's needed. That's really the idea of verse 1. God should be heeded before He's needed. Look what he says in verse 1. Remember when? Now. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. He says you should remember God and you should heed Him now before you actually, quote, in your mind, think you need Him. Solomon continues his theme of directing one's attention to God in the early years of life by employing that term he employed last week, remember. And remember this word here, it's not just kind of a willy-nilly laissez-faire attitude. The word remember here is to recollect and bring something to mind for the purpose of giving it your full attention. It goes beyond the passive kind of, afterthought mentality, like, I forgot to get eggs at the grocery store. I meant to drop off the dry cleaning day. It's not that kind of remember. It's the remember of this. I am intentionally I'm going to remember it because I'm going to kind of sticky note it to my forehead kind of a situation. I am going to keep this in the forefront of my mind, an intentionality to focus upon something or someone. And note what the someone is, or who the someone is. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. This term was used by poetical and wisdom writers to root the readers of Israel in their God's power as Creator, and subsequently then His authority as the ruler over creation. Your Creator, as we have on the screen there, is the object of the imperative, remember. Note when this Creator God, the ruler of the universe, should be given our attention. When should this God, who made us and rules over everything, start or begin to get our focused, intentional attention? He says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. It's the same term from last week for youth, talking about, if we could say, a pre-adulthood time period. A time that's enjoyable, a time that's often lighthearted or should be, a time that does not have the full demands of adult responsibility placed upon him. He said, that's not the time to just, I'm trying to think of the word I'm after, just kind frivolously use one's time. He said that's a formative time. It can be lighthearted because you don't have the full weight of adult responsibility, but that's the time, young person, that you should start to intentionally focus on your Creator God as ruler and also as authority in your life. It should draw you, young person, to consider Him and filter your thoughts and decisions about life through Him. And so here it is, this time for intentional cognizance, if we could say it that way, towards God. It is from the time of youth onward. He should receive our attention and subsequent submission to His rule as Creator in heaven before we perceive our need of His help. Note what Solomon says. You remember Him in the days of your youth, before or while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. As he's already clearly stated for us previously, the difficult days of human existence, they're going to come for all of us. He's been talking about that from chapter 11, verses 7 through 10. There's a lot of good days to enjoy. There's a lot of good days to rejoice about in your life here under the sun. But there's going to be some days that are dark. There's going to be some days that are difficult due to sin in your own life, sin in the lives of others, and the circumstances of living in a sinful world. There are going to be times of loss, times of heartache, times that are dark in our life. And you don't want to wait till then to have heeded God and His help in matters. So he advises us not to compound what's already going to take place in those dark days. Don't compound that suffering or frustration or issue by then adding into it your own willful negligence of God and His rule in your life. Note what he says here. He says, remember God as your Creator in the days of your youth, when the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. There's going to be plenty of dark days, but what he's speaking of directly here is this: the evil days because of your own choices. The choices you and I have made, maybe, that were away from the God who reigns in heaven, and they were indulgent in the affairs of man under the sun, and you have neglected His rule and His authority and His reign, and we've said no thank you, and now we've built up some of those from our youth on. The evil days come nigh at some point, do they not? You live those years out, and he says this, at the end of that time, by bucking God's authority and rule and not remembering Him, not focusing upon Him with intentionality, not yielding to His reign, he said the end result of those days is what? I have no pleasure in Him or in them. Such decisions rob God of His rightful rule in a person's life. They only produce one thing: bitter fruits. What someone thought might be satisfying, delightful, or worth pursuing only proves to be the opposite to that person because of their laissez-faire attitude towards their Creator. Like the way one author wrote it, he put it like this: to forget the Creator of youth is to invite bitter regrets and an empty existence in old age. To remember the Creator is to follow the path of wisdom and extend the joy of life. So Solomon says here, when it comes to this issue of remembering God in this life because you're going to meet Him again at death, he says this: God should be heeded before He's needed. Don't wait until you've made a lot of decisions you regret, a lot of decisions that are contrary to His desire, that are away from faith and are doubt-filled. Don't wait till then to remember God and focus upon God. Don't wait till there's been heartache and issue to look to God. Remember Him now in the days of thy youth. And now the passage takes what you might call, in our minds anyway, an awkward turn. An awkward turn because you think then he would kind of build up the glory and magnitude of God. You think he'd say, remember your Creator, and then go on to talk about His Creator as a reason or a rationale or a platform or a faith builder for why you would want to assemble yourself under His reign or His rule. But Solomon goes the opposite way. He writes almost antithetically in our mind here, because I think he knows the naive nature of young people or their rebellious heart of the old people that think they don't need to remember their God, or maybe they're deluded even about their frail condition. So verses 2 through 5 contain a series of illustrations or metaphors to illustrate what lies ahead, all things being equal. Now, we must note something about this next section here. Pastoral transparency. Reading it literally is one view that many commentators and historians, even back to about the 5th century, agree. You can read it literally and glean a meaning. There's some that think Solomon is speaking in another way, apocalyptically or in a judgment view, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or that he's speaking in a poetical way, a figurative way to describe old age. You say, well, which is it, Pastor? Well, we're going to look at all three, only for this reason. There's not agreement about what the interpretation, perhaps, of verses 2 through 5 are. So we want to look through all three. And Solomon says this is what death looks like. Knowing that God is the absolute ruler, and knowing that we in our sinfulness are prone to rebel and buck and think that's not going to be the case, will be the exception. That's what humanity does all the time. I'll be the exception to this rule. So he says, I'm going to help you out with what death looks like, because it's not what you think it's going to be, and it's not when you think it's going to be. And so we want to start by looking at verses 2 through 5 through this lens. Some see it as the gradual decline of a household, taken in a very literal view. This literal view sees the verses as a picture of a household or households that are generally slow and falling into ruin due to the decline of the home owner, with a funeral being the end result. So note the language Solomon uses in verse 2. He says, you should remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Then he says this, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened. In other words, that day will come when they are. Nor the clouds return after the rain. In other words, the day will come when they do. So verse 2 symbolizes the heyday of a home. He says, you want to remember God when the sun's out, when the normal operation of the cosmos is taking place, when there's no dark clouds from the storm and things are good. You should remember him then, not, as he says in verse 2, when things begin to deteriorate. He goes on and talks about in verse 3 about the decline in power and in productivity and personal health of the household owner and the household itself. He talks about decline in power there in verse 3. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders shall cease because they're few, and those that look out the windows will be darkened. So he talks here about a household starting to decline, and maybe in a literal fashion. He says the keepers and the strong men begin to tremble and bow themselves. The idea being this, in their time, each household would have had some protectors. If you were a person of significance of any sort, you would have had, if we could say it, a security system in flesh and blood. And so you would have had a protector or a steward or a security guard of the house, a strong man or a keeper. And that person, he says here, you want to remember God in the days of thy youth, before that strong man has to end up acquiescing his power to another powerful house because of the decline of power in one person's household. Think about it maybe in a feudal system, how one king would have been this, but when a greater king or this king got old and couldn't protect his house, this king would come and invade. That's kind of the idea he's saying here. He says, listen, you want to remember God before your household is a lesser than household at risk of being taken over. He talks about decline in productivity at this household. Grinders ceasing, people looking out windows being darkened, doors being shut, the noise of grinding being low. What does all this mean? Well, he's talking about those who get grain, or maybe are working with olives, trying to make them ready for the usage of the household or for selling there at the market. And he says, you want to remember God before those things become scarce. Before your workers are looking out the window and they become so old they lose their sight due to their age, or the doors are shut up on the house, indicating either there's been a tragedy in your household or you are shut up and unable to go to the marketplace that day. He says there, talks about the noise of the grinders being low. In other words, there are so few workers working on the grains or the olives that there's so few, it's just scant. It's like you hardly hear any workers at all. It's like you don't see anybody working in this household. So get this literal picture he's painting. Before there's travesty, before there's a change in the cosmos, before there's a decline in the productivity or power of this household, you need to remember God in the days of thy youth. He says, but you need to remember before there's a decline in personal health. Note what he says here in verse number 4. The doors are shut to the streets when the sound of the grinding is low, there's not a lot of people working at this house, and he shall rise up at the voice of a bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Now, many think that this is a literal idea of somebody starting to lose their hearing, and the only thing they can hear is the high, shrill pitch of the birds chirping, but they can't hear the majestic music played by ladies around them. Music was typically a symbol of rejoicing. They're afraid, it says there in verse 5, of scaling literal heights of hills and the toil that go along with it, as he says. They are afraid of that which is high and fears that be in the way. He goes on to speak about their appetite. He says there at the end, their desire shall fail. Their appetite for food, but most likely this is a euphemism for their desire for sexual satisfaction. It's completely ceased. He says, what remains then for this household, if this is a literal household, marking the decline of its owner and its subsequent weakness as a household, there's only one thing looming for that household, and that is the looming death of their owner and the dispersion of his goods. Note what he says here. He's like an almond tree that blossoms, the almond tree that flourishes. Now, I've never been around an almond tree. I don't know if we even do almond trees grow here. I don't even know if they do, But anyway, all this is to say, as I digress, is this. Almond trees in ancient Near East times, they didn't flourish in the summer heat. They flourished apparently in the wintertime. That was when they would blossom and bloom, and their blooms would be white. And it became to be known as a symbol of either old age, or it was utilized even by the minor prophets as a symbol of impending judgment or death. He goes on to talk about the grasshopper being a burden. You think about the destructive menace that grasshoppers and or locusts could be on a agrarian culture. And he says all these things are leading up in this literal household because a man goeth, it says in the end of verse 5, to his long home. The phrase for long home there is just indicating his eternal abiding place, his eternal resting place, where he will be or she will be forever. Then he tops it off by talking about the mourners that are in the streets. They're mourning because of the death of somebody. And really to kind of emphasize it, note what he says there at the end of verse 5. The mourners go about the streets, meaning they don't seem to cease from mourning. There's always somebody dying. There's always a household on the decline. There's always somebody marching towards or crawling towards their death. And so, one way that Solomon may be trying to vividly illustrate death is just the marked decline of what was once a powerful, vibrant household being seen in its power being diminished and being able to be taken over, its productivity sagging, and then the personal health of the owner or leader of that household becoming so poor that the only thing that they're waiting for is the next funeral pass to go by and mourn his or her death. So that is the quite literal idea or approach to verses 2 through 5. But I will say this. The second idea that some interpreters believe, even some rabbis believe, that this was a figurative speech talking about an apocalyptic or judgment-oriented view. In other words, looking all the way to the future. There's the thought that the language used describes a final day in judgment, as if there's a final reckoning of this individual's life or household taking place before the Creator who's in heaven of those under the sun. Verse 2, the natural course of nature ceases, the reversal of the process of creation, we could say it that way. There's no more heavenly lights. There are no more sunny days. There are only darkness. Verse 3 and 4 would talk about normal household activities and human economy would completely cease. And verse 5, the fears of the future would be fully recognized. And verse 6, which we'll read in a moment, that no amount of human resources could undo it. There are some rabbis who taught and believe that verses 2 through 5 were speaking not of an individual going to old age or their household declining, but of a future event that humanity as a household before God, they could do all these things, but the day comes that it's all going to cease because we will stand before God Almighty as the Creator, and our households will be undone because we are sinful individuals, and we needed to have remembered Him as an entire race and bucked and rebelled against Him. But then what most agree is this. 2 through 5 are a metaphor of old age. Most believe Solomon is using poetical language to describe the difficulty there is with getting old. In verse number 2, they would say he's using the sun and the light and the moon and the stars to describe failing eyesight of an individual, as those wonderful opportunities to have light and see other items around us start to fade or diminish. He says in verse 3 and 4, the collapse in one household is like a picturing of one getting older. The keeper of the house, the hands and arms begin to tremble. The strongmen, maybe being the knees and shoulder and legs, begin to bow and buckle and weaken somewhat. The grinders symbolizing in other parts of the Old Testament just your teeth. And so the idea that the grinders become few and scarce and their noise is quiet is because we don't have much teeth perhaps as we get older, especially in their culture. They didn't get to go and get some dental implants or some dentures. And so he could be saying that that one's teeth are not able to be utilized anymore. The windows becoming dark are depicting again losing your vision. The doors being shut and the grinding being low, being an idea of closed off, the lack of ability to hear, a loss of hearing. Rising up with the birds would be indicating how older individuals sometimes wake up early, cannot get back to sleep, and wish to sleep longer. I thought maybe if you would snicker there like, oh, that's me. Wait, he might be talking about that. Apparently, some believe that that's what was even taking place back then, perhaps. The issue of music indicates the weakening or quivering of one's voice, that it becomes low. And when it talks about somebody being afraid of the heights there in verse number 5 and the fears in the way, it's talking about as we get older, things that were not fearful to us before, they are fearful to us as if it was some high, unpassable item or issue to get to. He says there, the almond blossoms, talking about symbolizing white hair and grasshoppers. They're again talking about something being consumed and being desolate. He goes on to talk about desire failing, the loss, as we said, even of physical or sexual hunger, and the long home and mourners being, again, the day of one's funeral being there. No matter which view is the most accurate or correct, the overriding theme is unmistakable. We're all going to die. We're going to die someday, somewhere, somehow. And the reason Solomon devoted several verses with a bunch of illustrations or pictures, some of which may be somewhat foreign to us in the Western culture, is because he wanted this overriding theme to be unmistakable to younger people who maybe think, I don't need to remember God now. I've grown up in Israel. I know about Israel. I know about the God of Israel. And I know what I'll need to do when I'm older. But right now, he says, no, you need to remember him now. Because make no mistake about it, you will die at some point. If you make foolish decisions now, you live an old life age. It will be filled with regret and bitterness. He does this because he knows mankind is foolish enough in our deceptive sin nature to live as if death is inevitable or not inevitable, and as if it's not unexpected, and that's not the case. So he moves on lastly tonight to say this: usefulness comes to an end for everything. Usefulness comes to an end for everything. Note what he says in verse 6. Or ever the silver cord be loose, or the golden bowl be broken, and the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. As he continues discussing the reality of death, he speaks of items coming to the end of their usefulness and how God, unlike man, is unfazed by death. We're fazed by it, but he's not. And so he helps paint a picture with more illustrations in verse 6 by showing that death is not a respecter of persons. He speaks of several items here which serve as a useful purpose, albeit very different purposes. He talks about a silver cord and a golden bowl. Some would suggest perhaps these precious metals indicated do not matter, but it seems very evident that Solomon might be describing an item that only the wealthy of their time period would have had. And that would have been a very nice oil lamp, something held up, as he says, by some kind of silver wound cord and a nice golden bowl. That was a symbol of your wealth or your power in society. And so imagine this golden vessel is suspended by this beautiful silver cord. But then what happens to it? The cord snaps unexpectedly, and the bowl hits the ground and shatters or spills. You didn't expect it to happen to that. He then goes on and says, a common vessel. He says the pitcher used next to the well. This would be something used by a common person or a servant for drawing water out of the town's well or cistern. He goes on to describe a wheel or a pulley system. Again, an everyday item used by anyone. All of these items are purposeful and useful, assisting with either light or assisting with either water. And we both know that both light and water are symbols even for life throughout the Scripture. Also, a shared emphasis between all these items is the abrupt timing of their uselessness. He says that cord snaps, that bowl breaks, that picture explodes. The word for broken here means literally to be put to just shards, unusable shards. The wheel completely breaks, making the well or cistern inoperable. The point being made is that usefulness comes to an end very quickly for anybody. The rich, the gold bowl, the silver cord, and also the poor or the commoner, the wheel and the pitcher. Death is inevitable, and it has uncertainty about it. And it holds no prejudice. It does not matter if you're young and healthy and rich, or if you are old and poor and decrepit. Death comes often unexpected. It is inevitable. Like the way one author put it, he has reminded readers that death can come at any moment, not necessarily only when a person is old and feeble. See, he's wanting us to remember that there's a God in heaven who we are going to stand in front of someday, and he wants us to remember that death is no respecter of person because usefulness comes to an end for everything. He reminds us then, lastly, that man returns to the Creator. We will return to our Creator. Note what he says in verse 7. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was. And I want you to note his emphasis here. The Spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Death is mentioned in very direct terms now. Dust returns to the earth. What would that saying do for an Israelite, you think? As soon as they hear the dust returning to the earth, it immediately would evoke imagery of the creation account given by Moses to the children of Israel. What did God do? Formed them out of the dust element of his creation and granted them physical life and granted them spiritual life as well. But note what the author says. When this life is done, bodies will be buried and they'll decompose right back to what? The original dust we were formed out of, my friends. It reminds the reader of the finiteness of their existence. Very rich, educated, wealthy, upper class, they'll decompose just like the poorest. And nothing can change that. Nothing. They meet the same fate, the same way, which leads to his next thought. We are spiritual beings at our core. What does he say here about our spirit? It will return to the God who gave it. Our physical existence, we know, it will end. But then the core of our being will be returned back to its Creator. And so Solomon underscores God is the origin of life, and he is unfazed by death, whereas man is the recipient of life, and we are greatly affected by death. Both return to their origin. Thus, Solomon's closing statement, all done under the sun is fleeting and unsustainable indefinitely. Verse 8, he says his favorite saying outside of the God in heaven and man under the sun, saying, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. There's much to rejoice about our God. It's especially important to remember that we make life's choices in respect to God as our Creator, as our Judge, and as our God. Because vanity is vanity, all is vanity. Life is fleeting, and it is prone to emptiness apart from our Creator. And so he says, don't forget, man will return to his Creator. So how do we wrap this section up then? If we remember there's a God in heaven we're going to return back to, let's remember this. Each of us will experience death. Each of us are prone to think it is far from us. Each of us are incapable of knowing the unexpected moment it will happen. So what should we do? We should heed the very advice he gave to the youth. Remember now our Creator. Listen, it's best done in the times of youth, but it shouldn't stop there. It's not like I remembered him when I was a young person, and now that I've been around other Christians in our scenario, other Christians, I've been to church or read my Bible enough, now it's done. I don't have to remember him or be quite as sensitive about it as I once was. No, my friend, that would be a fallacy. We need him. Life is unexpectedly brief. Life contains evil perpetrated upon us. Life contains our own foolishness. Life is surrounded daily with sin and the reminder of death. So what should we do? Remember that the God in heaven, He is our Creator that we'll stand before and need to live in light of while we walk through this very transient, finite existence on this earth. And so Solomon, he may have given 3 imperatives to the young people, but he's still reaching out and saying, remember him now in the days of thy youth, and don't live the rest of your life as if he does not require or that you shouldn't desire his oversight, his rule, his authority, or his dominion in your life. And so, my friends, tonight, I would just encourage us with this. Remember God in this life because you're going to see him at death. It may not be the message that we like to hear because we like to think about this life just continuing on and the blessings we have and the memories we have just rolling on, and they will. And there's a lot to rejoice about, as he stated. But we shouldn't live this life frivolously then or negligent of the life that's to come, standing before him as our Creator, our Judge, and our God. Thankful he's our Father, but he's also our Lord as well. Father, help us tonight to be thoughtful about this very truth. And as we stand to sing a song of praise and dismissal to you, may our hearts be thoughtful about this. I'd ask that in this moment as we close in prayer, that each of us would remember we have this blessing and gift of life, but it has no guarantees. There are no certainties attached to it. And just because we're young doesn't mean we have our whole life ahead. And just because we're old doesn't mean it doesn't matter how we live. May we not live life and state verse 1 that I have no pleasure in it. May we live under your rule, under your dominion, cognizant of you as our Creator, and remember you now. For the grandparents in the room, may they teach their young people that you stewarded to them, and grandparents and nieces and nephew and grandkids. May they help them remember now thy Creator. For those of us with kids in our household, may they see the example that mom and dad just don't remember him when they were younger, they remember him now. May our kids also grow in what it is to remember you now. Not out of habit, but out of a heart who recognizes I've got an awesome God who has created me, who does know what is best in this life and the life to come. So I want to submit myself and align myself with his rule in heaven while I walk my life here under the sun. So Lord, may we be cognizant, may we remember, may we put it in our minds with your help and with your word and with your spirit. So Lord, we're asking these things to be accomplished for your glory through our lives and to make a difference in the world around us by your help as well. In Christ's name, amen. Let's stand tonight as Brother Nate comes to lead us in a song of dismissal.
Page 256, we'll sing My Savior's Love. We stand amazed in his presence. How marvelous that love of Jesus Christ is. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior. blessed in your week. You are dismissed.